Welcome. I see lots of folks starting to join us here. So I'm just going to give everyone a minute there's still people trickling in. So we'll give it just a minute or so and then we'll get started with our presentation and our panelists. I know it's hard to make it break in the middle of the day for some new content. So thank you to folks who are joining us. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and get things started because I'm just in the way of getting to the really good content. So I'll go quickly so that everyone, we can get started with Alicia and our panelists. So welcome to today's National Health Council webinar on inclusive workplaces, sustaining progress. I'm Susan Gaffney, if I don't already know you, and I'm the Executive Vice President here at the NHC. I just want to make sure that everyone is aware we are recording today's presentation, and it'll be available afterwards by request if you have any need for that for yourself, or you want to share it with colleagues if you find the content to be compelling. The NHC has just released a new report, Inclusive Workplaces Building a Representative Workforce, which includes insights on how to recruit diverse talent for specialized roles and constructing interview panels to promote diversity in hiring. The report was a follow-on from an event we did in October of 2021 of the same name, and really was a kickoff to our double down commitment to supporting our organizations that are in the NHC membership on all the variety of topics that are critical to their operational success, including diversity, equity, inclusion, but as a pillar of our strategic plan, really focusing on helping our organizations do the internal work that supports the external work they're doing to drive health equity. We feel like these things go hand in hand. We know it does for our own operations at NHC, and we always seek to be here as a support and an aid to your work on these critical issues. Let me introduce now our facilitator, Alicia Robinson. We're delighted to have back with us. She was our facilitator for the event in October, for those of you who were there. And she's back with us again today. And she is the senior partner for talent coaching and culture at the Equity Lab here in DC. She spearheads work around workplace culture, talent development, and adult learning practices as they apply to group coaching and one-on-one coaching environments. She brings 30 years of hands-on experience in the education and nonprofit sectors as a talent executive and a coach. And she's a dear friend of mine, and I just know that she'll bring great insight to the work that we're all doing. I'm going to hand it over now to Alicia to start things off with our member panelists, Diana Gray, President and CEO of the Hydrocephalus Association and NHC board member, and Sherman Gillums, who is a Chief Strategy and Impact Officer at NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Thank you all for being here today. Alicia?
Thanks so much, Susan. I'm so excited to be back and to see some familiar names and faces too from our session back in the fall. And so many things have happened in our world that we couldn't fully anticipate back when when I last joined you. But the call for inclusivity in the workplace remains both consistent and growing. And so excited to be talking about this again, and hopefully many of you had a chance to take a look at the report that Susan referenced a few minutes ago. In our last session, we discussed both the business case and the moral case for inclusivity. And today, I want to remind you of inclusivity's connection to wellness. Wellness has come up so much for us in the world, particularly in these last couple of years, and it's gained a lot of importance in the workplace as we deal with both the physical and the psychological toll of working during what now I hate to say is the third year of a global pandemic, essentially. So with that in mind, with this thought about wellness in mind and how that connects to inclusivity, let's take a quick pulse check of those of you that are in the space with us today. You see on the screen a poll, and in just a second, I'll let each of you answer these 4 questions to tell us where you fall on the scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree. Just take a second to complete that. think a few people just joined, so just a reminder, we're completing the poll that's on the screen right now. Kind of with some questions connected to wellness. I feel supported by my organization. I feel supported by my manager. What's the frequency of communication from leaders, and how has that been effective? And the communication from leaders helps me feel informed. Thank you for the poll results here. On the screen, you can see how we fell out here. Feeling support by the organization. Glad to say that most people seem to agree, that have most fall in the strongly agree to agree. And feeling support by manager, strongly agree to agree also is the highest rankings. And frequency of communications from leaders has been effective. Also strong agreements. And lastly, strong agreements that communications from leaders helps me feel informed. Of course, most of you are on different teams, but I hope this poll demonstrates how easy it is to get a quick team pulse, quick sense for how well your team is and where your leaders could lean in more at different points. If you do this, a survey sort of like this every month, every quarter, something like that, you can kind of look back at the quick results there and see where, again, you as a team or you as leaders are doing great work, and where there might be room for some improvement to help create a culture where belonging and inclusivity and equity really are reigning really strongly. And time and time again, I've seen so many opportunities for leaders to just simply ask questions like these that we avoid doing or forget to do in our haste to go through our daily work or stay focused on the priority goals in our organizations. And so just hope that poll gives you a couple of quick examples that you might consider using to just check in, just to see how are we doing, and where also might there be differences in teams, in subgroups identified by race or ethnicity or gender or different ability levels and things like that, to help you, again, think about where you and your organization might want to lean in a bit more. Employers, managers, and colleagues are awakening to the importance of contributing positively to how and why each employee works, and acknowledging that our unique and intersectional identities need room for the flexibility to address our differing wellness needs, right? So failure to do so can impact not only retention, of course, but also the level of satisfaction that can ensure optimal performance and results, sort of that business case that we talked about when we got together previously. So thinking about these topics, we want to dig into some more details about how organizations are actually living out these values or desires around inclusivity. And so let's turn to our panel for more insight and ideas. And as Susan mentioned before, we're joined today by two sector leaders, Diana Gray, CEO of the Hydrocephalus Foundation, and Sherman Gillums, Jr., who's the Chief Strategy and Impact Officer at NAMI. Diana, if I can turn to you first, I'd love to have you share a brief introduction of yourself and your work with our participants. Oh, I think you're still on mute, Diana. One of the things that continues to happen, no matter how long we've been on.
And I literally just clicked off mute, but for some reason, it didn't work. So again, I guess I'm still on the learning curve in the pandemic, but as Alicia said, I'm the president and CEO of the Hydrocephalus Association. I'm very proud to be the immediate past chair of the National Health Council Board. I've been working in the public health and nonprofit sector for nearly 35 years, first in HIV and AIDS, type 1 diabetes, lupus, and now hydrocephalus for 7 years. The mission at HA is to find a cure for hydrocephalus and improve the lives of those impacted by the condition. You may or may not know that hydrocephalus is a neurological condition that can affect anyone at any time through an injury or infection at birth or as an adult, and sometimes for unknown reasons. Seniors get a form of hydrocephalus called normal pressure hydrocephalus, which causes difficulty walking, dementia, and incontinence, and it's often misdiagnosed. Nearly 6% of people 80 years and older have this condition. I won't go into exactly what hydrocephalus is, but I will tell you it affects 1 million people in the US, and 1 out of 770 babies will develop hydrocephalus in their first year of life. With respect to HA, which I'll be talking to you about, we are a small team of 18 staff, but we strive to have the impact of 36 people. And I'm excited to be able to share with you some of the work as we are on our journey to create more diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. Sherman, we'll turn it to you for some brief words about your background and your work.
Let me make sure I'm off mute. Can you hear me? Sorry,
Loud
Diana.
and clear.
Well, like Diana, I am involved in mission work as well to raise awareness. In my case, it's about mental illness, which is a pretty broad concern that really doesn't respect demographical boundaries. NAMI is an organization of National Alliance on Mental Illness that has been around for 40 years, trying to ensure that laws considered the lived experience, and that could be either somebody who lives with some form of mental illness or family members or loved ones who have the experience of being a caregiver to someone who has that experience. And what this organization endeavors to do is to create a society that sees those people as human beings, fully enfranchised to participate in society, not broken individuals who need to be put in a room somewhere or locked in jails or kept hidden away from society. Because you'd be surprised how many people function with mental illness with the right support, I being one of them. I'm a veteran of the United States Marine Corps, was injured in service. I live with post-traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety. Doesn't make me special, especially given how productive I can be if I ask for help and see past the stigma that typically stop not just me as a veteran, but me as a Black man who comes from a community where faith was a big part of it. And that meant sometimes not relying on medicine and doctors to, to address some of the things that are part of just being a human being. So when you talk about intersectionality, as Diana mentioned, and I think Alicia might have mentioned, it's a big part of what we do and why we're focused on DEI. We can't help society if we don't understand society as a whole and how it's comprised. So we want to better understand all the different cultures that make up what society is, so that we can consider all the breadth of experiences in our work as advocates for people with mental illness.
Thank you, Sherman. And Diana, again, great to learn about your backgrounds, and we're really excited to have both of you here to share your personal perspectives and represent your organizations through those perspectives too. And so first question I want to ask is, as you've been on this journey towards equity and inclusivity within your organization, what are some formal mechanisms that you've created and put into place to ensure an inclusive workplace? And that you've really prioritized as critical to the way your organization works?
All right, okay, I'll go first, and I'm off mute. So we did launch a formal DEI initiative in early 2021 with guidance from an outside consultant, and I hope to talk a little more about that as we move through the presentation. We also have a very strong statement of inclusion in our employee handbook and on job postings. We've had an intentional focus on building and maintaining a diverse staff. I know that the report, which is excellent, talked about not just counting, so I believe we shouldn't count, but I also believe data matters. So we currently have a team that is 44% diverse representation with respect to race and ethnicity, only 1 male, so we're not doing very good on that front. Those poor guys, we've got to hire some more. And adding in disability, we're at 50%. I think another important part of our work is making sure our website has representative photos and language, so our organization is viewed as welcoming to a diverse population for our community and prospective employees. And not all diversity is seen, but we are welcoming to all gender identities and sexual orientation and have been representative in this way as well. There are also photos on our website of our staff and board so that we have transparency in our leadership. So hopefully potential job applicants will see someone who looks like them. And our board is increasingly focusing on increasing diversity and seeking more candidates who will provide this diversity in thinking. And I believe this matters to employees as well. And then finally, things like making sure MLK Day is a holiday. It wasn't when I joined the organization, and making sure staff have freedom to celebrate religious holidays that require leave from work are also formal ways of being inclusive.
Thank you. Yeah, those are some great, both small and large ways that you have been able to do that, it sounds like, in the last couple of years. How about you, Sherman?
Well, in keeping with Diana's theme, we started inward. We wanted to determine where we were exactly before we could figure out where we wanted to go with diversity and inclusivity. So the first real formal mechanism of inclusion involved measuring our cultural proficiency, because we can't manage what we don't measure. So we had to set a baseline understanding of who we were organization-wide. And what we did a culturally and linguistically appropriate services assessment for the entire organization. It happened for the first time ever. And the assessment was revealing because it objectively shaped our identity. Like, we couldn't say who we were. The data don't lie. You know, it tells you who you are. And it put a spotlight on our diversity, equity, and inclusion through the perspectives of everyone who was allowed to participate, from the national office to the field staff. And what we found out was that while we value diversity, we weren't very diverse, as Diana revealed. I mean, when you look in the mirror, it'll tell you what you are. So the first mechanism was being very deliberate in our hiring practices to look for people who would help us better translate the experiences of a society that we serve. As I said in the opening, we have to look like society in order to serve it, in order to have that relationship. So our first objective was to ensure that, that when we hire people, things like distinctively Black or ethnic names weren't, sort of weeded out of the process. You can start by just looking at your staff roster. I'm not saying that's the only reflection, but if everybody's name is William, Jennifer, Mary, there could be Black people in there. There very well could be. My name is Sherman. I mean, I have a name that doesn't tell you exactly who I am, but when you go far enough and you start to see trends like, okay, these names really don't tell me, you may have a problem with subconscious bias in some ways if you're the person who's making that decision. So those are little areas that we try to focus on and pay attention to, so that we're what we want other organizations to aspire to be. But it started with an inward focus.
Thank you. And I think, Diana, I appreciated your plug too for having a partner in this work. It's one of the things I do in my work at the Equity Lab too. My next question is about how your organization has really supported managers and teams to be more inclusive. And I imagine, as there's a question in the chat too from, I think it's Rael, correct me if I'm wrong, apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, but question about learning more about the role of the outside consultant, and if you've had a DEI committee or things like that, that also might connect to how then you're supporting your managers and teams to do this work too.
Sure. We used a consultant named Danielle Marshall, who is with Culture Principles. And certainly we had a few of us look at and interview the consultant and try to make sure, and that group was diverse as well. And then we launched this DEI initiative with all staff, and we hope to continue this with our board as we're starting to do strategic planning for our next plan. But to assist, like Sherman, to assist in developing intercultural competence, we did individual assessments using the Intercultural Development Inventory, the IDI. And these results were delivered individually by our DEI consultant, so that, myself as CEO didn't know any individual's results. And then an average result was applied to our whole workplace. So we knew how we were as a whole in terms of that scale. Anywhere from denial, polarization, minimization, acceptance, and adaptation were the sort of levels. It's not a perfect assessment, but it's a place to start. We then held 2 partial day workshops with staff over a couple of months, and that involved a lot of pre-work, from readings to videos and self-assessment work, and your own journey and activity plan. And then we were able to also apply in our second workshop some of our learnings to real examples in our workplace and how to solve them. We intend to incorporate DEI goals in our upcoming strategic plan rather than have a separate plan, because DEI initiatives should impact everything we're doing. And then aside from the DEI initiative, we also have tried to have discussions. Again, we're an 18-member staff team, so it's easier to do things like this, but we have monthly staff meetings. And when major events in our country happen, like the televised murder of George Floyd and the January 6th attack on our democracy, that may be risky to open that up, but these issues affected everyone very personally. And I was surprised how willing our team was to share their thoughts and feelings. And in the George Floyd example, it was our Black employees who really led the discussion, and the rest of us really listened and supported, because there were many feelings about that, and I think it made us closer. So that's what we're trying to do to help our managers and team be more inclusive.
Thank you. Sherman, anything you'd add, or anything that's similar, anything that's different about what NAMI's done?
I'll dovetail a little bit off of something Diana mentioned. When our military didn't do that after Martin Luther King was assassinated, while they were in Vietnam, the country paid a price, because on those bases, they weren't just fighting a war against the enemy, they were also fighting a war within. All right, so the military this time around, when George Floyd died on video, they took great pains to make sure that people of color who were in uniform didn't have that similar experience. So I'll just mention that as an aside. Well, inclusion efforts, when I talk about them, I talk about it in the metaphorical term of an orbit. I don't use hierarchical terms because it suggests that importance, trickles down. When it doesn't, it's really an orbit where people like me, Diana, you, and Susan, we sit sort of at the center. And the gravitational pull of culture, of encouragement, of influence is what you do to help your managers and those people who are at the outer edges of the orbit where the people touch your work. It's really there where you support them through those things that are beyond policy. It's really demonstrating the behavior at the center and having them see that and want to model that behavior, and they're rewarding that behavior. So it starts with how you walk and talk as a senior leader. That's how you support managers, and then you reward them for emulating that same behavior. And as it reaches the outer edges, consider that an assessment of you as a person who is the center, who's the sun, where the gravitation starts. And if it's not going well, hold yourself accountable first. That's the best way you support senior leaders in this work. Not senior leaders, but all of your managers in this work.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. And both of you have talked about collecting data, surveying your staff in various ways. And I, of course, did the poll before we kicked off here. So there's, we know there's lots of ways to kind of check in with our staff to see how they feel the inclusion and belonging levels are working within the organization. But can you tell us, as you've done those things, what are some lessons you've learned to really make sure that that assessment is really accurate and it's actually telling you, particularly what the most marginalized staff, the staff that might feel most unlikely to be the ones to speak up in traditional situations, are actually telling you the truth about how they're feeling?
Well, one of the things that I believe is you don't always know how someone is feeling unless you ask them. So particularly now where we're more distributed, given the working remotely, and we're already a little bit distributed across the country, but I've been trying to make an effort to reach out to staff that I don't see on Zooms every day. And I've enjoyed those individual conversations. And I'm sure as CEO, they don't always tell me all their grievances, but at least they know I'm asking, and I want to know how they're doing, both personally and how through the pandemic and work. So I think it starts at leadership. Like you said, Sherman, you have to model those behaviors. And so minimally, I believe that's important. And I believe that my management team is doing the same thing with their departments and their direct reports. And one of the next things I want to do is, given that we've been in this new work model for a while, and some are dipping their toes into going back a little bit, and some are prefer remote working, is I really want to do a climate survey that's anonymous, so that I can really hear, okay, you said you wanted to do this, in 2021. What are you thinking now about how your workplace is working? And so that's the next step that I want to do, to gauge how people are feeling.
Thanks for that, Diana. And before I turn to Sherman, I'm just curious, again, given the size of your organization, some people sometimes shy away from giving a survey because with 18 people, it can be kind of clear who's saying what, or whatever. So just how do you solve for that? What advice do you have for people on the Zoom today who might have a similar size or might be thinking of like a smaller subset of their team and are concerned about not having enough anonymity or?
Sure. I don't know that you can completely fix that. I think some of the questions can be, on a Likert scale so that it doesn't give anything away. But certainly we also want that really good qualitative data too. And so at that point, you may be able to figure it out, but anonymity is still there and confidentiality is still there. If a comment comes up and you're like, oh yeah, I know who that is. So I do think trust and providing many questions that help people to feel like I can say what I really feel. If I really disagree that we're doing a good job, or I really hate this workplace, that's not necessarily in the comments.
Yeah, fair. And same question to you, Sherman, just thinking about some of the things that you all have done to make sure you're getting authentic feedback, but also if you can share that from the vantage point that you're at in NAMI, where I think you have 100 people on NAMI staff officially, but affiliates all over the country. So how do you do that with your actual staff, but also model it for potentially smaller groups?
Well, we definitely turned to a third-party consultant so that, it wasn't us collecting the information. They even had a third-party email, so it didn't look like it was going, to HR, and then you just have to have the trust. There are always going to be people who won't fully trust, and you have to work on that. But what we learned through these efforts is they have to be non-essentialized. And what I mean by that is there's no cookie cutter approach that worked in one company, so it's going to work, nor are there quick fixes, behind like temporary surges in these concerted efforts. They're habituated and promoted as mindsets through conversations with employees about their experiences as people who both desire inclusion, as well as people who may have to give up some aspect of inclusion to make room for other people. And this is where discussions on things like privilege and entitlement get tough, because as the saying goes, equality feels like oppression where you're used to privilege. It just feels like you're losing something. So I've also learned that leaders have to be consistent in how they make the business case, right? You have to make a business case for DEI. It can't just be because George Floyd died or, DEI is a hot ticket right now, so we got to do it. They actually have to make a case to employees that being more inclusive at their level will give them access to better ideas, more innovations, better insights on the customer or constituent base that you serve, and that serves the business goals of the organization. So if you can do that, that's one of the things we learned is that you have to really tie it into why is this necessary, not simply a fad or something we have to do because of cancel culture or all the things we kind of put out there. That there's a real business reason for doing so. Yeah,
and I appreciate how you both kind of shared that it's not only the mechanism that you use to try to get the feedback, but how you follow through with it, essentially. What that, as Diana, you described, how you build the trust, how you continue to get authentic feedback and such too. So thanks for that. I'm also hoping, I think all of us that are on some level of DEI journey, inclusive workplace journey, are always looking for some quick fixes. Unfortunately, it's not always quick. And at the same time, we learn so much from others' experiences and just understanding key strategies that others have used and things that they have used that they wouldn't recommend that you use. So curious first, Diana, if you can first share some key strategies your org has used to make all staff, regardless of identity or background, really feel appreciated and included. And if there's anything in particular that you'd really highlight that's particularly important for systemically marginalized identity groups, and any strategies, as I said before, that you would say, don't do this. I've learned not to do this one.
Sure. Well, one of the things we do for all staff is before they even arrive, there's an announcement that a new team member has joined, and everybody piles on with email, welcome, we can't wait for you. So hopefully before they arrive, they know that they're coming into a warm team. New employee onboarding is really important to me. And typically they're meeting other staff one-on-one, so they kind of get that sense to get to know what other people do and get to build a relationship with them. Sometimes it's one with, a couple people from a team, but I think that's important too, to feel instantly like I know other people that I'm working with. In our monthly staff meetings, I almost every time lead a sharing exercise in the beginning. So everyone is engaged. If you're not reporting, everyone's speaking, and we can learn something about each other. And sometimes it's more thoughtful and feelings, and other times it's fun, like what's your favorite Thanksgiving food? I mean, we had a lot of recipe sharing after that, so that was sort of fun. We celebrate everyone's birthday, which when we were in the office, that was in the office, and now it's still over email. And one of the things I do is try to calendar everyone's anniversary, work anniversary, and send them a note from me. And most of the time, they didn't know it was their anniversary. So it was like, hey, I didn't even realize I'd been here 5 years today. Other things, staff retreats, holiday parties. In one of our staff retreats, I'm a certified Myers-Briggs consultant. So I did an MBTI assessment, and we discussed the results as a team. And so no one was forced to share their type, but almost everyone did. And we learned more about work styles. We learned more about each other and how we take in information and make decisions, and no type is superior or inferior. So I think that helps. Regarding systematically marginalized groups, the one I thought of was the transgender population, especially right now, it's in the light. I found that asking how they want to be identified is helpful rather than just making assumptions. And for all marginalized groups, I wouldn't assume that I understand their experience based on race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation. I would want to have more of those conversations. Something I would never do is shame someone who makes a mistake. And I know that that happens sometimes. We want to shame the other side. You're not as enlightened as me. And so I think that never helps grow anyone's experience if they feel like they've been made to feel less than because they made a mistake.
Great example. Thank you, Diana. Sherman, what are your thoughts?
First of all, I'm an INTJ, Diana. So it was great for me to find that out because it's also great for strategists in business. So it falls right in line. One of the most important strategies, this is a little counterintuitive, is to try not to isolate DEI to a department or like that one person of color you hire to be the chief or director of DEIs. Now, those roles are good starting points, but there's a reason we don't hire a chief of integrity or director of professionalism in our companies, because we expect those things to thread through everything that we do. And being inclusive eventually in the ideal state should be the same way. So we ask leaders at NAMI in every business unit to include a DEI component to their work and tell us, how did you satisfy the organizational goals in the DEI space, and how did you measure that? How do you know that that's having an effect? And that way DEI remains a shared responsibility that has to be practiced and articulated by everybody, not just a box to check. In terms of the systematically marginalized groups, whether you're a person of color, a woman, or a member of the transgender community, or a person with a disability, my advice, if we're giving advice to those folks, is go to work for organizations that value you, right? We want to challenge the status quo by provoking it. We don't want people with unique lived experiences to feel like they have to be what I call social structure martyrs, right? Be that first one and bring the company along. The company doesn't see or respect you, or you find yourself constantly walking the thin line of having to negotiate your existence in that company, leave the company, right? Make it hard for them to keep you. Now, if you can't leave, and there are instances like that, at least understand that the flaw is with the company, not you because of your identity, all right? And if you stay, that they're lucky to have you. And you just walk that way. You walk that walk like they're lucky I'm here to tolerate this. And at some point, if they decide to do better, you know, you're there to help them with that. Whoops. Let me put my camera back up. Sorry about that. And then if as far as things I wouldn't do, I never was a big fan of mandatory sensitivity training. It's a Band-Aid. It's popular. There are studies that show that they really haven't worked over the year, but you're putting a Band-Aid on what I call a gushing wound. This is probably a Marine thing, but it can do more harm than good if employees see it as pro forma, instead of you know, being convinced that it's intended to bring about beneficial change. It also has the effect of tokenizing some employees and making them feel like that they're you know, they're part of this whole wokeism run amok criticism you hear whenever you hear people talk about trying to do better. I think being aware and more sensitive is not a goal. That's not really the goal, not to be aware and sensitive. It's not even not being racist or sexist. Of course you shouldn't. But how do you become anti-racist and anti-sexist and anti-homophobic so that when your kids go work in a company, if they happen to fall in those identity groups, which by the way, you know, white males who are gay or white males who are disabled, I mean, there are acquired aspects of intersectionality that when you fix a system for people who are marginalized, even if you're in that quote unquote dominant group, you can find yourself marginalized because of other aspects of who you are. And if you haven't made it easier for other people, when you fall victim, the same thing will happen to you. And we see this with people with disabilities all the time. They don't care about your race or ethnicity in some instances. You're disabled, so you're marginalized. So when you make it better for marginalized groups, no matter who you are, I being a Black male, I want to see anybody who's white, a woman, gay, or any of the other groups where I may not identify also have that shot, because I'm ultimately making it better for myself as well.
Thanks for that insight, Sherman. And you know, the work both of you are describing that your organizations have been doing for a few years now can, particularly in the middle of a global pandemic and you know, a racial awakening in our country as well as abroad too, can lead to some fatigue and some resistance, which you both have kind of touched on a little bit. And particularly, as I think I want to kind of tie in Kira's question in the chat too here. One of the pieces, you know, we were joking earlier about the fun of being on Zoom for the last couple of years, but, you know, as we get used to whatever we call this new normal or this new phase that we're in, you know, you're doing this great work on DEI, and then we throw in like, okay, now we're going to do all these sensitive conversations virtually, right? Like we're not going to be in the same space. We've got other things to consider, right? So, yeah, how do you kind of go about facing those challenges that come along the way and personally keep yourself energized and your teams energized around this work? And you know, to more directly answer Kira's question, if you have any thoughts on things that you have done, particularly in this new virtual world that we are not just in temporarily, we probably are in permanently in certain ways, at least, try to make sure that that is an inclusive space too.
I think one of the things that occurred, because we did have to do our workshops on Zoom to make people feel safe, was that we couldn't ask we couldn't say, oh, you know, Lakeisha, tell us what you're thinking. And we couldn't pressure another person to answer a question. It had to be, you had to self-identify that I want to be in this, instead of, hey, you. So people felt like they could either not participate in a conversation or they could. And I did actually have one employee who kept calling on one of her team members, and I had to text her privately and say, you need to stop calling on your direct reports because it's making them uncomfortable. Because this is a sensitive topic and you don't want to be put on the spot when you're not ready to speak. So I think that's important. I think relative to fatigue, I think in challenges, some of our staff were a little overwhelmed and expressed concern about the amount of pre-work that they had to do before these workshops. I don't have time. I already have a heavy workload. I have to do all this stuff. So that was an extra thing. But I think when they did it, they appreciated some of the learnings that we received from it, but that was a challenge. I think for me, the frustration is that some of the changes we want to make take longer than we had hoped they would take. And so again, we're on a journey. It's a process. We hope to keep improving. It's not something we just check off the list. Oh, we did DEI training and workshop, and now we're done. We really want to incorporate this in the work we do, not only with our employees, but with the consumers of our services. What energizes me is I get energized around maintaining a diverse team of engaged staff and a board of directors, not only because it'll make us a better organization, and Sherman talked about the business case for that, but that those we serve deserve to see this representation in our workforce.
I'll start with the part about the new abnormal, I've been calling it. It's been sort of bittersweet because this current way we communicate and has become normalized. It's democratized communication, right? Now, if you've got somebody with a disability or a single parent, or somebody who is, better working at home and more authentic, they now can jump in and unmute their mic and speak, or people who are facilitating can be a little more circumspect about how people are contributing or not, and offer persons. And that whole introversion, extroversion thing, we did a study on that in virtual classrooms. It's a real thing. And so if you understand your people, like Diana said, you understand how they're wired, you'll have a better sense of how to include people so that turn of talk, way of people sort of jumping in and finding their space doesn't become something that just happens. It's something you can be deliberate about, so you can give people opportunities. The other side of that, though, is if you rely too much on this form of communication, some people become avatars of themselves. You never force society in 3D to adapt to persons with disabilities if all they do is sit behind a desk and do a job all day. So it's almost like, while 2 years has been great for persons in wheelchairs or who may have medical issues that make it easier to work from home and be productive, but they also need to be able to participate in society. So this should not become a crutch, for businesses not to adapt their buildings because, oh, we'll just have you work from home. We don't want to do the reasonable accommodation because, that'll cost. So we'll just have you. That may work for some people, but it doesn't work for everybody. And it doesn't make you a good society eventually. So it's with reason. You kind of take a look at, how we've evolved. But I do hope that what we don't give up, even as things open back up, is the authenticity that we feel at work. It's okay for your kid to run by, your pet to walk in front of your laptop. I was on one call, I mentioned this yesterday, and some guy had a chicken run by in his living room, and it was okay. It was funny, but he was in Puerto Rico, and so I'm like, that's cool. That's just, he's not a bad person or a bad worker. He's just in his environment. And I hope we don't lose that. I hope we stay authentic and allow people to be their authentic selves. Now, you can't bring all those things to work with you, your pet and your kid and your chicken, but you can demonstrate how productive employees can be if you allow them to be themselves, and maybe factor that in somehow when you talk about who you want to hire and bring in and that kind of thing. And that gives you access to far more people, right? If you be strategic about that. What energizes me, most organizations that I've worked in were either, if you're familiar with the cultural proficiency continuum, they're between that blindness and pre-competence, right? So while nobody tolerates outright racism, the microaggressions still happen, the subtle hostilities, So what I try to do is, one, avoid political talk at work. We don't need to talk your politics. I don't care who you voted for. It really doesn't matter how you feel about Trump or Obama. This is your job. Respect everybody. But the other part of it is when you give people a way to express themselves in a way that's honest and helpful, you see magic happen in certain workspaces, not politically, but in other ways where they're talking about who they are. I love that kind of work because it's like planting a new seed in an organization that doesn't have it yet. So that energizes me. The possibility that you can plant a new seed in an organization and everybody feel better about working there.
I love that. I think one of my favorite things about inclusivity work too, is just that we are kind of imagining a future we've never seen before, right? So we're planting, as you said, Sherman, planting those seeds. We're creating new ways of being with ourselves and with each other. And so I appreciate that that keeps you energized, and hope others find some inspiration in that too, as an energy driver for ourselves and our future generations, right? And why this is important. And as Susan said in the chat, we do have time for some more questions or comments from the audience. So feel free to add your thoughts to the chat. And while you're doing that, I have one last question for Diana and Sherman, which is just, as your organizations have focused more deliberately on this work, because I think in some ways you probably were both doing, your organization was both doing this before you formally deliberately said it. What really has surprised you the most? What's emerged as the most interesting thing that you weren't expecting to happen with this?
I think, I don't know if it was a big surprise, but maybe I am, given my team, because the varying degrees around which some feel this is important. And I would add that for my staff and my board. There are some that like, why are we focusing on this? Why? They don't get the business case yet, Sherman. So I've got some work to do. But others are really on board. And so that's great. And then again, not a surprise, but a disappointment is, no matter, and I think a reality, and I have this too, no matter how open and inclusive we strive to be, I believe we all have unconscious bias. I have it, I see it, I'm like, oh my, I just did that. I just thought that. And so I think the need for us to all continue to have that self-awareness of when we are having microaggressions or when unconscious bias happens.
Thanks for sharing that. That kind of repair side of this work is really important too. We're going to make mistakes, all of us, no matter what our identities are, and knowing how to acknowledge that and repair it is such an important piece. Sherman, how about you? What surprised you?
Yeah, well, I'll kind of dovetail what Diana said. Before I talked about the results for the assessment we did, and I'm a Black man after George Floyd, so I'm kind of like expected to be the message bearer for a lot of this. But before I talked about that with the town hall we had, I opened up about my own failures in homophobia as a person who grew up in a community that didn't see people who were gay as people. And then in the Marine Corps, where I had the same experience, and how I had to reconcile that before I can stand in front of anybody and talk about racism or anything else. And I owned it. And I wanted to demonstrate cultural humility because I was getting ready to force them into that same sense of reconciliation by pointing to data that said, you can do better. But I wanted to show them, this is what it looks like. I'm not here to, to knock you over the head with this. I too have work to do, maybe in a different context. We're talking about Floyd and all that stuff now, but this is a human problem we're having. So I was, that's kind of how I broached the topic. But what surprised me most was how honest people are willing to be about how they feel and come to terms with themselves when it's safe to be transparent and vulnerable. Most people I encounter aren't racist. They're simply a part of systems that reward identity less than merit. They reward you for being a man more often than they reward you for being a woman, or being white than Black in certain ways, right? Even as a person who is Black and has a fair amount of advanced education, I don't mind being called an affirmative action case because it's not a bad thing. It was a corrective measure. But if that's all you think I am, despite the fact that I probably have grades better than most people that I work with, that's not an exaggeration. That's just the way it is. People see you through a certain lens because we're conditioned to do that. So if society keeps conditioning people to do that, they're going to be what society spits out. But if you give them the space to be honest about that and say, hey, I grew up in a place where I didn't meet a Black person until I got to college. What do you expect to happen in those cases? And if you give them the room to say that, and then when I explain to them, like I did with the Vietnam and Martin Luther King getting killed, this isn't new. This country goes through this when things happen. And if you imagine being a soldier in Vietnam, having to go on combat patrols, and you just heard that Martin Luther King died, then you might understand why people go to work feeling like George Floyd was an attack on their identity. It doesn't have to be, I mean, this whole race thing is this social construct is what bound us all together, and why we feel like when it happens to one, it happens to others. And if you didn't see Derek Chauvin as a representation of you because you're white, but we saw Floyd that way because he's Black, then you understand the dynamic. It's a different dynamic. And when you try to make it make sense to people, an amazing thing happens. Those people who didn't see themselves as woke warriors, they become the biggest ambassadors for DEI because they understand the greater good now. They understand that it's not about taking something away from you. It's about making sure that your son or daughter, if they happen to be gay or if they happen to be disabled, are in a society that's already preconditioned to marginalize certain people. That's better for you. And I'm surprised when those people turn into the type of people that you almost have to pull them back because they feel like they're making up for something, or they have to apologize. And it's like, no, you're just a full human being. You get to be human. And we have this problem we have to deal with. So I think what surprised me, though, is that when you give people a chance to be honest and to release, they'll give you more than you expect, but you just have to give them that space to do that.
These are great final words as we close the panel part of our conversation today. One of the things also that keeps me energized about this work is how much I get to keep learning and growing from it. So I really appreciate, and I've taken a bunch of notes myself from things that you guys have said, and I hope others have too. Really appreciate your insights and your sharing your journeys with us, Diana and Sherman. And don't go anywhere yet, though, because we're going to turn it back to Susan to do a little bit more Q&A with us, and we may have a need for some more insight from you all.
Thanks, Alicia. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Sherman. I think that I'm sure the audience feels like I do, that I'm just so appreciative of the generosity that you brought to the panel today in sharing your experiences. And you know, I think that by being so honest and forthcoming with what the work that you're doing, it helps build that safety and that trust to let other people explore what they're doing and consider ways of doing it better. So really just appreciate everything that you brought to that. We did have one more question in the chat that I'd love to get your thoughts on, and yours as well, Alicia. We have Janet Church from Sjogren's who's asking, who's about to launch a search. And any ideas, any practical ideas for ensuring that the pool of candidates is maximally diverse. So did I get that right, Janet, or do you want to go ahead and pose that question?
No, that's exactly right. You know, all the any new ideas of ensuring the broadest application pool instead of doing the usual thing.
Right. At NHC, we did start advertising differently. And I think it starts there. You have to have if you keep doing what you've always done, you'll keep getting what you've always got. So you have to be willing to be creative and thoughtful. I know that we looked at a lot of there's a lot of smaller job boards for professional societies and things like that, different universities that are more diverse than others. We looked at all those kind of ways to make sure that our openings were reaching a broader audience than just the, put it on Indeed or Idealist kind of thing. And in just 2 years, I feel like we've actually seen very measurable change in who we're bringing into the pool and who we're hiring. It wasn't that hard. That's been our experience, to just invite and welcome more people into the pool. But I welcome other suggestions from the panel.
Yeah, I'd add too that it does start with, I love the idea of advertising differently as Susan described it, and also as Rael has described it in the chat. Even before that, sort of what does your job description look like too? And then before you put it out there, like how is that attracting a diverse environment of people? So yeah, it's some basic things that are like making sure, just even from a gender identity perspective, that you're not using words that tend to turn off women or that sound more like things that are he related or yeah, that you're not saying the person in this job, he will do this or something like that, but it's more of inclusive of any gender identity. And also thinking about the things that do invite equity and inclusivity into your organization. I think Diana spoke before about including her statements of their equity statements on the job announcements, probably on your website too. Then, but also things like being transparent with the salary, for example, are things that really help bring in people who aren't going to just kind of waste their time finding out that the salary that's at 55,000 really, and they have to make 100,000 isn't going to work for them. Just really knowing that up front, and also kind of examining what you have traditionally required of candidates before you bring them on. Do they have to have a bachelor's degree? Do they have to have a degree in accounting? What are those things that are kind of creating barriers to getting a wide pool of people?
Right. One thing that we recently changed was that standard language around you have to be able to lift 15 pounds, which is really not inclusive of people with various disabilities. And so do we really need someone to lift 15 pounds? No, we don't. We can, if that's required, we can work around that in the workplace. So really that thoughtful lens of what do you really need? Just don't go in that pro forma, like check, check, check. We'll just keep doing it the same way. Really examine it. Diana, Sherman, do you have ideas you want to add to this? I know there's some ideas in the chat.
Yeah,
Jim.
I'll be quick.
Check that out.
First of all, make sure you understand tokenism. Understand that tokenism is a thing, and you can easily find yourself trying to find the unicorn. You know, that one Black person or Asian person or gay person who just, it doesn't work like that. The best jobs I ever got were jobs I got because I had relationships with people. In fact, that's part of the problem why C-suites are so homogenous, because they're based on relationships. Form relationships with professional organizations or unions or entities that might have somebody who's working right now and you want that person. And you make them feel valued if you go hunt them down and say, hey, I want you to come. It's not because you're Black, it's because we have made the business case, and I keep saying Black because that's my bias, but we've made the business case that having this type of person makes us stronger, not because we want to meet a goal. So be very careful about the tokenism, good intent, but it turns into something different. And then, you know, kind of make a relationship happen before you expect people to see a posting and gravitate to your company. That's not the best way to fish for talent if you're really looking for somebody to fill a substantive role. Diana?
The only thing that I would add, because all of this has been great, is to ask your staff to also use the posting to share it with their community. And I think if you're a happy employee and you are excited to share it with people you know, I think those kinds of referrals are always important, and that helps us increase our diversity as well.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Well, I know we're just coming right up to the hour, and I'm so grateful to all of you who joined us today, because, you know, carving out right in the middle of the day, that hour to dedicate to really listening and learning can be hard, but I hope that you felt like it was worthwhile. I know that I did. And I'm so appreciative to our facilitator, Alicia, and our panelists, Diana and Sherman, who were so generous with your ideas and your experiences. And we look forward to continuing these kind of discussions so that we can all continue making progress together. This is a long haul effort, and it's something that we need to really integrate into how we do everything. So appreciate all of that, and we'll say thank you, and hopefully it's sunny where you are, it's sunny where I am, so have a lovely afternoon.